Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Globalism, the New World Order. These are certain terms that we're hearing a lot about, but more impactfully today, it's also known as the Great Reset, which is a war against the people of the world. We're going to learn what this is all about as we get joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a guest, Michael Steger, who is a longtime representative of the LaRouche PAC, which we're going to find out more about. And we're going to learn about how this group is going to try to help give more sovereignty to nations around the world and what their work exactly is. Michael, thank you for being on the program today.
Hi, thanks, Daniel.
Now let's talk about who Lyndon LaRouche was and what LaRouche PAC was all about.
Okay, sure. LaRouche was a bit of a man before his time, I guess. In the 1960s and 70s, really starting around 1966, after fighting some of the ills of McCarthyism and that kind of social control process that was ongoing then. At the time, in the mid-60s, he was an economist and a consultant in New York City. And he saw the development of the New Left as something that he identified would be a threat to civilization. He had papers like the left's social control and fascism. So he was basically building a movement of what many of the people consider themselves to be kind of anti-war activists, young college-type students in the late 60s and 70s. But his clear sense was that this new left concept was a very real threat to civilization. It was anti-industrial, anti-scientific. It looked to things we could probably touch on with the Great Reset, like psychological outlooks like B.F. Skinner. But these ideas as a social movement, if they did march through the institutions, which was their so-called plan, and I'd say it was probably effective, would begin to dismantle Western civilization. And in that context, he became a leading part of kind of an intelligence process looking at global terrorism, the drug trade, international finance. And in that process, he began to develop a series of both economic forecasts, things like the takedown of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. That kind of put him on the map on a global scale. He's one of the few economists of the world who had the foresight to see that coming in the mid-60s. And he began to put forward in that context a series of large-scale development projects. He says the real question of what we're facing, if we're going to deal with the growing population, the dangers of the Cold War, and the general questions of poverty, hunger, starvation that we continue to face, you're going to have to develop broad-scale infrastructure projects. The very things that we did with the Tennessee Valley Authority or the transcontinental railroads, the development of electricity and power supply, perhaps first and foremost. And we've got to develop a banking and financial system connected to the sovereignty of nations that can extend credit, can extend lines of credit for big development projects. And so we started to proffer those projects to various nations, some of which became under very serious discussion. And then he began running for president in 1976 and ran for president 8 times, basically going after the globalists, what he would often refer as the British Empire, which is kind of the center of this dynamic in finance, the drug trade, and terrorism. And offering a sense, I would say kind of offering at least my generation, I didn't join the movement back then, I joined in the early 2000s, a sense of the true United States, that there's a history in the United States that really has rejected this outlook from the very beginning, even back in the 1620s and 30s with the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that what Benjamin Franklin and Washington and Hamilton had understood was that we need a place in the world as a new nation to begin to grow and really develop, to use the industrial and creative capacity of every individual to build and develop a nation and really a better society. And so he kind of brought that to bear with his presidential campaign. There's much more I could say. He was probably the last thing I might want to mention is that he made a remarkable forecast in January of 2001 on a question regarding John Ashcroft and the incoming Bush administration. He was very clear that under this program with Bush, we would be facing a Reichstag fire-like event, referencing what brought the Nazis into power. And of course, within 9 months, we were facing 9/11. So Mr. LaRouche had his finger on the pulse of things that were developing. He had a certain foresight and forecast that really drove our political intervention, and it's kind of the basis of what we're doing today.
You know, it's really fascinating when people really look into what we're talking about when it concerns the global reset, that this is actually a movement that's been going on for about 100 years or better. It used to be known as the Green Movement back in the day, which is the idea that science somehow can run society better than anybody else can, to create sort of a, what would you call this, like a socialization of people, like you were mentioning earlier. And, you know, one of the things about it is you see it really grow and scream a lot more now, is the fact that people are becoming very concerned about what this actually means. Oh, sure, it may be great to sit around and gather a paycheck that you don't have to earn, but after a while they're going to realize, you know, you really don't add much to what's going on here, so, you know, where do you go from there, kind of a thing. And that's just one of many things that are going on here, and that it seems that the educational system has done a really good job about brainwashing a lot of people to believe that this is a great way to go under the guise of the new Green Deal, Agenda 21, Agenda, 2030, things like that. And, as I was looking at some of his bio, especially here on Wikipedia, I noticed that one of the people that he had a regular target on that I couldn't stand for a lot of years either, and just recently Donald Trump finally gave him the boot out of the Pentagon, was one Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, Kissinger was a key figure in this, and you could say this globalist program. I mean, they've retooled it and remarketed it. Today it's the Klaus Schwab's Great Reset, but the policy has been the same. I think what might be different today is how they have decided to approach doing this, or maybe they just continue to. But Kissinger was at the center. People can go back. One of the most critical documents of Kissinger to get a sense of how nasty. And I would say, look, you saw the same thing with Bolshevism.
Right.
You saw the same thing with with the Nazis. And much of this is modeled goes back thousands of years, the same kind of program with the Roman Empire. What Kissinger stated in 1972 in that National Security Memorandum 200 is that we've basically got to lower populations in other countries, that the population growth of other countries is now a national security threat to the United States, basically adopting a hardcore Malthusian, you could say, kind of the passive genocidal policy. We're just going to let people starve and die. We can't afford to have these populations grow and develop. And that was Kissinger's official policy, and he pushed on the Nixon administration, and it was adopted certainly by the establishment for decades.
I know, too, when you think about the timing of this, as I understand it, this was a movement that was all just about dead by the 1960s, But then all of a sudden there was a gentleman by the name of Brzezinski, who was going along, and he was still in the hardcore belief as an activist about keeping this thing alive, and he caught the ear of one David Rockefeller. And there was the money. And then all of a sudden you can see by the early part of the 1970s, this was a movement that was about to grow as a result of David Rockefeller, from what I understand. And then, of course, as we talked about Henry Kissinger, you can see all of his nefarious deeds from that point forward. And as I understand it, they were eyeing and trying to, or looking to groom upcoming Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the beginning of how now they got this into the political system, as I understand it. Is that the way that Lyndon LaRouche seen it as well?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. I mean, I was just reading a document of his from 1988 where he goes through very precisely that, and I wouldn't say it was necessarily dead. I think it was in the very people who created things like the Conservation Fund, or what's now the World Wildlife Foundation, the Julian Huxleys of this world. Huxley, before he was set up the Conservation Fund and started the UNESCO at the United Nations, was the leading eugenicist. And you'll find that the Rockefellers and these kind of Anglo-American sets pre-World War I and II in the United States had adopted this kind of eugenics perspective. It was coming directly out of the kind of the Darwinian or Thomas Huxley networks in Britain. We all know Aldous Huxley's work, The Brave New World. But Julian was setting up this eugenics program, and this was the very basis for what we saw with the Nazi health science. So the whole green movement ultimately was an attempt to put a fuzzy bear face, kind of the fuzzy, friendly, fuzzy face, on the front of something which was a eugenics or race-based science or all the things we've come to associate with the kind of the Nazi regime. And they began to retool it after World War II. And when the 1960s developed, you saw what was brought together, which was this radical set, this kind of Bolshevik set of a small grouping of inner elites, so-called elites, were going to then be brought to power as a concept, as a construct of what the intention was. Forget the rest of the population. Forget the productive working people of the country or the world. And it was mixed with then this counterculture, whether it's the Frankfurt School, these various kind of post-World War II cults in the various kind of universities. But it's become a very real threat to civilization today. And I would say that this Great Reset, one of the things that I was, before in thinking about the show and discussion today, what struck my mind was, people might remember this, but in Time magazine, in April of 2009, they published an article, and it was entitled, How Obama is Using the Science of Change. And of course, I think your audience is probably aware of the Great Reset is really premised on the pandemic. The fear of the pandemic is now a rush that we've got to restructure how our entire society functions. But in this entire paper, which is worth people reviewing, it's somewhat striking almost at every turn, and it really gives a sense. But they intend to use behavioral psychology, the psychology built off of the assumption that human beings are simply herd-like creatures, animals.
Right. Mm-hmm. Social engineering was the phrase I was trying to come up with earlier.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's it, and that's what Obama had done. And at one point I think what to me really kind of captures it, briefly they say at one point, sometimes, because the whole question was nudge. It was the big Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein was a major factor in attempting to control the Tea Party networks and 9/11 groups, the various kind of political process that's been pulsing in our country now for a number of decades, since 9/11 especially, how to infiltrate those. That same Cass Sunstein wrote a book called Nudge. That's the whole idea, is that somehow we can convince people. Well, I'll put it one way. What they define by nudge is that instead of having you opt into something, let's have you opt out. So we're going to automatically enroll people in various things, and now you can leave, but you have to decide you're going to leave. They also believe in convincing people based on everybody else is doing it. And then at one point in this article, they say, and sometimes you just need a shove. Yes, it's good to make it easy. It's good to make it popular. You can even make it lucrative. But the best thing to do is just make it mandatory. And so this is, I think, the kind of dynamic we're facing, is to how do you now basically make it compulsory to join in this kind of new age, new world agenda.
Now, it's really all pretty wild when you take a look at it. I remember when Barack Obama was first running for president, at first I would be honest in saying, then as I wasn't really paying attention to politics as much, is the reason I said, I'd like to see him get in office is just the very thing that he ran on, which was change. It didn't take me long to realize that there's something off about this guy, and I just don't trust it anymore, because he's great about being out there and talking, but he didn't really promise a whole lot, and he certainly didn't do anything that was really favorable for the United States. and now you see it ushering a blatant sort of here's all the billboards about, as you mentioned earlier, people who had been for years creating either associations or foundations that were moving us more and more away from the ability to even have a voice, much less the ability and power to vote for anything. I know my understanding is that's what the Trans-Pacific Partnership was all about, and the restructuring of NAFTA, things like that. And when I sometimes talk to people about this, they'll say, well, what proof do you have of this? And I'll say, well, you just take a look at some of the things that are going on here, and if this Trans-Pacific Partnership hadn't been dismantled by, Donald Trump, you'd be looking at a board of, 22 people who are going to decide, what's good for the rest of the world, and you're not going to be able to make a decision one way or another about it because these are unelected officials. And I would say, these were a lot of the things that the LaRouche PAC was really taking a hard look at about what we can do about all that.
Yeah, it's very clear that the structure that, it was well known, I think, back in the 20s and 30s that fascism, which was a particular approach towards what was a broader philosophical form of government, which many people like the Rockefellers and others on Wall Street were largely supportive of, which was corporatism. And that the TPP is explicit. The Obama program, as much as he preached hope and change and the identification of helping the marginalized Americans somehow engage, his entire hardcore program was entirely corporatist. We saw this with the bailouts. We saw it with his first visit to London, which I think was February of 2009. It was at the G7 meeting, or G8 at that time, and it was to discuss and resolve the bail-in mechanisms, where you actually would confiscate people's accounts. And that's part of this great reset. Part of this reset is, how do you get rid of national currencies? How do you turn everything into digital currencies? And the thing with digital currencies, beyond letting the central banks decide to print or retract money at will, it also is a complete control mechanism. It's almost like setting up society as if it was some kind of psychological game. And they would reward you with currency and coins if you did the right thing, and they would withdraw coins and currency if you did the wrong things, like a social point scoring kind of process. And you can certainly see that this is really behind the way these guys are building up this corporatist control of society. All of this fails. It's all kind of Roman cult ideologies. And the question is to really challenge it. And I think part of challenging it from the LaRouche PAC perspective is that, take the example of the voting fraud. We all saw this happen on November 3rd. It wasn't as if you can see the reclips of when CNN shows you certain vote tallies in a state, and then within 15 minutes they show less votes. Like there clearly was a vote manipulation going on. They stopped certain states. We all saw it. The point today is, are we going to move state legislatures? Are you going to move members of Congress to take up responsibility for this? Or even judges, which haven't taken the responsibility to even hear the cases? Are we simply going to move many people who have in some cases just have one foot in this kind of globalist perspective, or at least have considered joining it at a state or at a local representative level? Are we going to convince them simply that fraud took place, you have to do something? From LaRouche PAC's perspective, a missing aspect of this, and something Donald Trump has brought to bear in his campaign for president, but has been overshadowed by all of the attacks against him, is the positive conception of what we can actually do as a human species. That B.F. Skinner's view that there is free will, there is no human soul, we're simply a kind of a malleable creature like an intelligent dog, is a satanic conception, that mankind is far more capable of remarkable things, broad-scale developments, breakthroughs in science, like we saw, though some people, the vaccine can be questionable, but take the Artemis project, the decide to colonize the moon, move on to Mars. These kinds of abilities are unique within the human species. And they express that quality of free will, that ability to think about future generations. And from our perspective, this is one of the most important antidotes that start to revive a certain sense of a real political fight and real political opposition to these other much more dark doctrines.
And it's so true, especially when you talk about, for instance, the vote. I remember we were actually up in Salt Lake City when that was all going on. I'm looking at the board thinking, well, one funny anomaly I noticed is you could turn it on to the different news stations and everybody all had different numbers. It's like, well, we learned about these numbers 2 hours ago and you guys are just telling us about it now. What in the hell's going on with the news cycle here? So, but what I found phenomenal was the fact that he was, so doing very well in those key states that are all being contested right now. And then all of a sudden they stopped counting the vote, and I was like, well, I've never heard of anything like that before. And the next thing Biden's ahead, and I'm like, he was too far behind to get ahead. It just doesn't make any sense. And I keep remembering a scene from the movie Heaven Can Wait, starring Warren Beatty, where heaven pulls him out of his body too early and brings him up to heaven before he's supposed to be there. And the guy who actually ends up taking over his case says, do you ever notice the likelihood of someone being right greatly increases in proportion to those who try to prove them wrong? And you look at all the screaming and yelling from all these states saying, no, we played fair, and you realize the louder they get, the more likely it is that they did something wrong, and that they're really trying to push and move this into this situation. And I kind of wonder if Lyndon was alive today, how he would look at this and what he would have to say about this, especially to the American people.
Yeah, I often think that question. The thing that stands out, Sidney Powell actually made reference to this in that Pennsylvania press conference they gave early on after the election, which was a reference to the 1775. Because in some ways, I think we are very much looking at that as something, the only comparable moment to today in American history would be that process, in a certain sense. There are other aspects. The Civil War, of course, people have referenced, and the Lincoln quality that Trump has brought to the Republican Party. But that 1775 process was a kind of spontaneous eruption. It wasn't something fully planned. The British policies, as people may know, but once the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, ended in 1763, the British Empire was bankrupted. They needed to start tax farming, and the colonies were their direct choice. So heavy-handed taxes, heavy-handed political control to impose those taxes were now ongoing for 12 years. And that's what led then to the buildup. Of course, we all know the tea tax and the Tea Party. So then there was this an eruption at Concord and Lexington, and then the march to Bunker Hill, and then the siege of the Boston Harbor by Washington, that Washington eventually joined and led, that drove the British out of Boston. That kind of eruption, I believe, we've seen now today. I noticed a marked difference in many of the people we are engaged with and talking with and collaborating. There was an excitement about the election, but much of their identity was still electoral politics. We can vote, we can trust the system at a basic level, we can vote, we can mobilize, and we can maintain a change in the course of the country. Many people today realize that if we're going to change and return this country to its constitutional foundations and commitments to grow and develop, it's going to be outside or beyond just electoral politics. That we're seeing a kind of an American uprising. As one of my friends put it, the American people were unfortunately a long slumbering bear, but that bear has now been woken and it's very hangry. And I thought that was an appropriate reference.
Well, here's the thing to take a look at too. As popular as the Obama first run was, when he's run around, he was something fresh and different. There's no doubt about that. But when you take a look at, the second run, it's like any other presidential election. When they go for a second term, it'll have momentum, basically maybe because there isn't anybody better to run against them. But in this particular case here, what you've seen, nobody really cared whether there was going to be a Democratic Party running in this. What they mostly cared about is, let's put Trump back in there for another 4 more years. And here's what's fascinating about that is when you looked at all these rallies. Now, I've seen presidential elections going back as far as Richard Nixon. Now, that's not a long stretch, but for a lot of people, it's, probably pretty long for them. But I had never seen the rally sizes that I had seen this year. There were times you would just have tears in your eyes, and it wasn't just because it was Donald Trump. It's because you could feel the spirit of America and American people going, you know what, we have been laying around too long. This guy's coming in here, he's taking a hell of a beating, he's still getting in there, and he's still getting things done. Maybe it's time for us to get up and start helping this guy, get America back. And now, because of this pandemic that locked a lot of people in, they began to learn about this, and it's really wild, some of the conversations that you'll have with people out there about this whole thing, and they really want to know more about, what is this global reset? What is globalization? I keep hearing about corporatocracy and technocracy, and the reality is, I think this beast is just about ready to get its head cut off. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree. It's been a fight these last 20 years, watching us move more and more towards a surveillance state, the endless wars, the bailouts, the kind of Silicon Valley tech control, the social control aspects of the so-called big tech. To see the American people engage, and to see very much what I think any true American revolutionary quality is that the productive people, the people that are willing to get their hands dirty and make this country truly function on an industrial, hard-working level, that there's a commitment there to grow and develop. You can see it. And they're not going to go back, and the genie's out of the bottle. It's
Right.
not going back to where it was. There's a passion, there's a fight. I think they're not fighting just for themselves. And they're explicit about it. People are clear. They're like, this is for my grandchildren. This is for coming generations. We can't go back. We can't let this continue. It's too psychotic. It's too insane. If they steal the election, it's going to make them only more angry.
They'll probably just run down the White House.
It's possible. It's possible.
And there's a lot of unique, things going around about what actually is going to happen. In fact, I just recently had a guest on the program, one Susan Bradford, who's really a wonderful research journalist who looks into not just the global reset, that's kind of part of it, but mostly into the British Kingdom. And she, will tell you a lot of eye-opening stuff, that just is pretty incredible. But she actually just recently said on our program, there is no way that Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated because he's in hot water with espionage. He's done. In fact, I think I said, as I understand it, he's walking around with an arrest boot on his foot. Now, how does a guy become inaugurated as president when he's, under a boot arrest right now? I mean, something's going down, and we've been doing a lot of deep dives into this, but I think that Lyndon LaRouche probably would have been very entertained by what I would call right now the greatest show on earth. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, it's scary, but at the same time, it's exciting.
It is. It is. There's the threat of the reset has been something looming, and the question was, when were the American people going to stand up? How long were they going to take this? And Obama. The thing with Obama, our intervention there, I think, was a very striking one, and it actually came on the heels of this Time magazine article, where this was right when Obama was unveiling the Obamacare program. And, at the time, we had worked for decades with many of the black community representatives, people that were leadership in the civil rights movement, were part of the kind of the LaRouche coalition, what LaRouche had built up with these multiple presidential campaigns, working with inner cities to revive their industrial base. They're largely a Christian orientation to this black community. at that time, unlike what you see today with these things like Black Lives Matter and things. But this was a real broad coalition that LaRouche had built up, and of course there was great support from that community towards Obama. But Mr. LaRouche realized the threat of this guy was so severe, and it was a psychological threat. And if you remember, Paul Ryan was in lockstep with Obama. Much of the Republican establishment was. The Obamacare policy came out of Mitt Romney. It was modeled off what Romney had done in Massachusetts. It's one of the famous lines from their debates. And so Mr. LaRouche saw what was taking place, and we put out a pamphlet on Obamacare with a picture of Obama talking with Adolf Hitler, a photoshopped image. And we went after Obamacare as the T4 policy. This was Hitler's Tiergarten fear. It was the center of his kind of the Nazi medicine program, compulsory Nazi medicine program. And soon after that, as we saw the Obama administration develop, we actually put a Hitler mustache on Obama.
Did you crop his hair too?
Yeah, a little bit, but it was an effective mustache, and this was all over the country. This was in rallies. I remember visiting family in Michigan. It was on the nightly news. We had a huge picture of Obama with a Hitler mustache inside a rally going after the congressman out there in the Detroit area, one of the longest serving guy. It was a famous town hall event. A father had wheeled up his son in a wheelchair because he was quadriplegic, and he says, "Are you going to kill my son?" And here we are with a huge picture of Obama with a Hitler mustache. And in some sense, I see what's happening today is connected to that moment, because people started to realize there was something far more nefarious, something far more evil going on, and they were willing to respond to it. Now, what Biden is anyone's guess, because can this guy even make it? Is he even going to survive until the inauguration? And if he does, how long does that survive? That's always been clear, I think, to most people looking at it in a sober way. The real question is what we can mobilize as a program. I mean, do we take over the Republican Party? Do we build a new one? But I think we've got 30 to 40 million Americans that are ready to mobilize in a certain kind of political army. And the question is to define that. Trump's opposition to the NDAA and to the whole Liz Cheney faction, and to say we're not going to continue these wars. We're not going to continue to have 40,000 troops in Germany or 50,000 in Europe. What are we doing? Our nation's falling apart. We've got homelessness everywhere, and you want to maintain massive troop deployments in these endless wars? You want to set legislation that a president can't withdraw troops? You guys are insane. I think the American people see this. I think we can build a coalition of even that perhaps is double the size. And perhaps many people who didn't like Donald Trump are soon going to realize that what they've got with Joe Biden is perhaps far worse than anything they could have ever imagined.
Well, and they better, and it was interesting because I know at a time when people became interested, well, who are you voting for? And I said, well, for Donald Trump. I said, have you taken a look at what this guy's done? And they were under the impression that somehow I was Republican. And I said, no, not for one thing, Donald Trump's not a Republican, not at all. Certainly not the Republican Party we've come to know now. And I said, this is a guy that just gets into office and he takes care of business, and I felt very inspired by that. But the fact is, too, is I think Mitch McConnell did a pretty good job by saying, well, I now have to congratulate Joe Biden finally on becoming President of the United States after the Monday vote on the Electoral College. And that pretty much, I think, all but cemented the doom of the old guard Republican Party. Now, to give the listeners some perspective here, this whole globalist reset movement that we're talking about here today is this. It goes back and it starts with Jimmy Carter, even though the movement, as we both agree, had been going on for quite a long time before that. But as it began to stick in the United States and policies were initiated, as well as associations and foundations and so forth, starts with Jimmy Carter. It kind of skips over Ronald Reagan probably a little bit, but then re-cements itself with George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama. So that's 5 presidents right there that were involved in basically selling America down the river and really essentially the whole world. Now, a couple of things that we haven't talked about that are important to know about this is this globalization. Of course, we talked about population reduction. They see this, eugenicists. Bill Gates is one of the people that are on the chopping block as well. But when you take a look at what they want, is they want money and power, and this starts with the central banking system. Why don't we go ahead and kind of enlighten our listeners about what that actually is, because this goes back to even the Rothschild dynasty. And as I understand, we've captured all that we have the gold, so to speak, and so things are about to change, as we've seen evidenced by the Trump administration pulling the Federal Reserve into the U.S. Treasury. So now he has control of that. So how does the LaRouche Pact take a look at all this?
Well, that was, in some sense, that was the fight that, to a large extent, Trump was prevented from waging full scale. I think to your point with Mitch McConnell, I think the only people supporting a Biden administration might be the Republicans in the Senate. So
because they want to keep things the way they used to be, where they can ride politics and build bank accounts for their future generations. The hell with the American people and anybody else in the world.
Exactly, and most of the Democratic base is going to despise Biden and his policies. It's not going to have the pretty face of Obama. Harris couldn't even get 2% in Democratic primaries.
Yeah, so she bailed out before they even got to the vote.
Right. So there's no.
She was also the one that raised the most money during that.
Right. No, it was attempted to be. She was supposed to be the new Obama candidate, but everybody hated her. So the real war. I mean, Trump has been able to pull back much of the psychosis, whether it was the psychosis culturally. We saw with the sex change stuff that was just perverse under the Obama period. The border questions, he's created a certain sanity in collaboration with Mexico and Central American countries to stop the Soros operations. And he's pulled back much of the war deployment, even though the entire 4 years he had opposition from all of the generals, all of the Pentagon. But he's been able to ultimately bring back and end a lot of these wars. He could have done much more if he had any kind of support or collaboration. But this fight with Wall Street and the central bankers, with London, which is really the center of international banking.
Yeah, as I understand it, the globalists are pretty much centered in London as well as the finance and so forth, right?
You'd have to say that that's been their headquarters for a couple of 100 years at this point.
Right. Because what I think it's really unique, I came to this awareness probably about 2 weeks ago as I was talking with a particular guest, and I began to realize, wait a minute, the British Empire at one time went around like a conquistador, as I likened it when I was talking to the guest, going around and conquering people, with force. But eventually I think they came to the realization, well, this is costing us a heck of a lot of money. We're going broke doing it this way. And I think that's when the Rothschild family says, well, here's a different way that we can do this, where you can get everybody else to do the dirty work and we'll just finance through you and we'll just set things up. And now I'm of the suspicion, and I don't know how true this is, when you look at the Chinese Communist Party, that really truly isn't the Chinese, because the Chinese people, it's a wonderful culture, but it's an extension of the British Empire. Would you agree with that?
There are certainly elements, there is no doubt. The influences on Mao himself, philosophically, and what they structured, was certainly British influence. People like Bertrand Russell stand out. I think, and the point you're making of this shift from kind of the redcoat British Empire to what you might say is the liberal empire, it happened after the American Civil War.
Right.
At the point that they no longer could destroy the United States, and the United States has become the industrial power of the world. Take this right to the central banks and currency question. Look at in the 1880s, you had the Species Resumption Act, where you began to restrict the ability of the government to extend lines of credit and create currency. You are now beginning to impose upon the United States, from an ultra-national perspective, It is kind of the British control via Wall Street, the control of national currency. And that's ultimately the process that begins the takeover by the central banks, by the Federal Reserve. And what we now see is a deindustrialization policy. It was Volcker who literally was talking of deindustrialization. And as head of the central bank, the Federal Reserve under Jimmy Carter. So that's really, I think, been the basis of it. And what you've seen in places like China and every nation is the adoption of similar tendencies, especially with Silicon Valley. That same kind of technology orientation, the green orientation. You just had the Federal Reserve sign a document this week which agreed to green the entire financial system. What does that even mean? It means shutting down, first and foremost, energy supply. If there is one component, if you look at any nation, if you look at all nations around the world and you want to look at one component with life expectancy, look at the energy production of the nation, and you will see an immediate correlation with life expectancy. The more energy, the longer people live. And that's exactly what they intend to shut down. There's another element of China, which is how they've rapidly developed, which is that they use old American system techniques. They had set up banks, banks lent for large-scale infrastructure and development projects, and they've rapidly developed the interior parts of their country. But there are other elements, and every nation faces this. Every nation feels the pressure of the IMF or of Wall Street in London in terms of credit and lending. And they're doing the exact same thing to the United States. And as you said, they've done it since Jimmy Carter explicitly. They've shut down the credit and financing of the development of our own country. And I think that's really the fight that Trump's second term is going to have to take on.
Well, he's certainly going to be taking it on with a big gain of support from a lot of people, you know, and I'm thinking globally. And I think what makes this really something that's real eye-opening when you really pull back, go to, let's say, in aircraft terms, up to the 60,000-foot limit and take a real big overview of this whole thing. You take a look at how the globalists have turned us against each other around the world. So this is more of like a cultural war. And that's a really hard one to fight and be successful at, because you really don't know who the enemy is. I mean, even here in the United States with the, what is it called, the woke movement, all of a sudden we've become the bad guys. We don't even realize what we've done wrong. You got somebody like an Oprah Winfrey out there chiming out, and apparently I just recently discovered one of the people she loved promoting was Iyanla Vanzant, self-proclaimed Christian follower of Jesus, you know, condemning white people with white privilege. Really? I'm just this, you know, Caucasian American trying to support my family, and I've become the bad guy. But this is the kind of crap they've pulled. Now, I've actually had people ask me, you know, well, how do you know what a globalist is? And I said, when you begin to read about the evolution of this, you look at the language, and these people are so living out of their heads. You can hear it in their language, that it has never really had any practical application that was sustainable. To give you an idea, just recently in Australia, their vaccine program had to all be scrapped as people were beginning to test positive for HIV. Now, maybe I'm stretching things a bit, but it seems that now that they've tried to implement, in other words, take this theory they've just gleefully loved about themselves, about how smart they are, they applied it to the real world, and the real world says this sucks and it doesn't work. So how much further do you think the rest of their junk is going to go?
No, it's true. It's true. I mean, it's a cultural war. And in a certain sense, most war is really culture. It's why propaganda. I mean, take this question of U.S. and China. There are certainly threats coming from China. There's no doubt of that. But like you said, it's not the Chinese people, just like much of the world sees threats from the United States establishment. But the American people aren't interested in going after and attacking other countries. That's not in our interest. We've got many problems here at home. And you can see the attempt to manipulate nations into a kind of geopolitical confrontation. And this is what I think you get at this woke movement. What's it really intending to do? The whole process, the whole counterculture, the intention of it from the very beginning, from the people who are setting it up. And you can look at the Frankfurt School, and there's as kind of a key, as the key network of so-called intellectuals that shaped Hollywood, that shaped the anti-war movement, is a destruction of the Judeo-Christian culture. And I think to a large extent they've had a huge impact, as we know and we see. And the thing about this, and this is something that the LaRouche movement did back in the 70s, what Lyndon LaRouche decided to do is he had a bunch of very smart young people who wanted to try to stop the war, but also stop this kind of imperial process. He said, well, let's find out what's really happened. Let's figure out what our civilization has actually been about. And he deployed them, and he had recruited young people all over Europe, in Germany and France and Italy. I mean, it was thousands of young people mobilized from this kind of perspective to oppose the new left. And they did real research going into the libraries of the ancient libraries of Europe, you might say, to figure out what happened. What happened with the Renaissance? What happened with these questions of scientific development? You know, was Francis Bacon really the founder of scientific thought? Well, of course not. This guy's British intelligence at best. He's like a John Brennan type, you might say, or something like that. But there's a real course of science. And what the organization found was that there was a key figure in the Italian Renaissance period, or the beginning of it, the early stages, a guy named a Cardinal, Nicholas of Cusa. And what he had done is he had said, in looking at the Middle Ages, he said, we're missing something. There was these references to Plato. And they went back and they actually revived some of Plato's original writings. And they found that the real quality of Judeo-Christian culture came out of this ancient Greek Renaissance. The thoughts of John, the New Testament, these ideas, that there was a living, pulsing quality of a sense of creativity, a sense of knowability of the universe, a sense of immortality of the human soul. These questions which then, in the development of Christianity, began a cultural process that has shaped the course of civilization. It was that which has been targeted. And to a large extent, that's what we have to revive today. We have to revive as much as possible, not in some formal educational or institutional way, but through organizing, I think, this revolutionary movement now in the United States to overthrow this globalist reset program, to reestablish the U.S. Constitution. We have to bring back this 2,000, 3,000 years of the development of Western civilization. I think we all remember, Jesse Jackson, at Stanford attacking the education program as just a bunch of dead white men. Well, they weren't just attacking us old white men today. They're attacking literally the very fabric of our culture. The people like Augustine, the people that shaped our sense of identity, that really set the foundations. And just to put a point on it, this guy Cusa, who plays such a profound role, he actually works with the map makers and the intellectuals that end up working with Christopher Columbus, because he says basically on his deathbed, Europe is done. Europe has basically been lost to this globalist outlook, this imperial outlook. We've got to get out of here. And they begin to look to colonize and set up a new kind of society. And ultimately that becomes the United States. And I think really that's why you see this fight against this reset, this fight against this green agenda, is more prominent and more viable here than it will be in any other nation in the world. And it's because of that very reason. It's in the very fabric of our culture and of our nation's history.
Now, I do want to believe that there has been an elaborate plan that's been set up over the last, I want to say, at least 6 years, and then which up into included, and I'm probably taking a stretch for a lot of listeners, but again, as I said, I've really looked into this for a long time, that the United States military wanted to do a coup, and they needed the right person with the right kind of courage and energy to do that. And so that's how they convinced Donald Trump to run for the presidency. Now, Hillary was supposedly guaranteed to become president. And that's why she was so upset when she's lost. Now, there's a theory that the military kind of went in there and manipulated the vote for Donald Trump to win because they were clearly doing the same crap that they're doing now, of manipulating the vote. Unfortunately, they didn't do it right. They manipulated it, and it didn't work out too well. But pretty much as I've been kind of taking a look, just this big stage look at the whole thing, pretty much how this plan was laid out in different ways, you wouldn't become aware of it until more or less after the fact, but it's all pretty much come true. And it's pretty wild when you're looking at this, and there are so few people I can even talk to about this because they would just be astonished. Like, no, I mean, you'd be mind blown at some of the things that have, like for instance, Barack Obama shut down Guantanamo Bay. Trump reopened it and apparently added another something like $400 million to expand it. And there are some other places that are opening up now. So I think there's a large, what you might say, we've already taken care of the big stuff. That's already done. Now we're just sweeping and mopping up the garbage in the street. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think the big stuff we still have to. This central bank question, these bankers. I mean, Trump is he knows Wall Street very well.
Oh yeah.
And so this is something that he's put on the back burner because he was dealing with an outright coup. I mean, what we saw. I think we'll all remember that press conference in Trump Tower where he goes after the intelligence agencies as a bunch of Nazis. I mean, that was legendary. But I think you're right. I think there are certain elements of our national security, our military, maybe not a lot of the generals like Mattis and Kelly, but the rank and files and a lot of the colonels and below who had a sense that this was time. A lot of our military intelligence, I think people know Pat Lang's blog. Something similar happened with Mr. LaRouche. At the time that people like Roger Stone and Donald Trump were just beginning their collaboration, it was in the 1970s, 77, that Mr. LaRouche he'd intervened on Jimmy Carter and said, if Jimmy Carter's elected, we're facing nuclear war because of people like Brzezinski, much like what you described. And he did a primetime intervention nationally on television for 30 minutes that went through this argument. But iconic. LaRouche was he used to wear a bow tie because he was a factory consultant. You never wear long ties in the factory. So it was a bit of an iconic, intervention. But following that, members of the old OSS, the patriotic side of it, the ones that would have supported Vietnam's independence, that kind of thing, came and contacted him. And that brought Mr. LaRouche into discussion with Ronald Reagan eventually. And this became then the Strategic Defense Initiative, the idea of we're going to change the Cold War from Kissinger's MAD into a defense system and a technology cooperation program. This really blew the lid off the globalist program at that time, and that's when they went after LaRouche with assassination attempts, as well as then the federal. They literally had Robert Mueller run a similar kind of legal assassination against Mr. LaRouche, the very same Robert Mueller. But it was in this late 70s, early 80s where people like Trump and Roger Stone are collaborating. And I believe that this is this kind of patriotic current through American history. And Trump has been biding his time, talking to these people, talking to these patriotic layers, and launched his campaign when he knew he absolutely had to do it. And I think there is a huge component, and the question is to get more organized and to have a real program, because there are many people who, because of the propaganda machine, didn't understand what Trump was actually offering. And that's what we have to really start to build up, because I think this is, we have the numbers. We can overwhelm this. Like you said, we could even surround the White House. I mean, we have the numbers in this process.
Oh, yeah. What, 75 million people, give or take, that voted for this man? Are you kidding me? And then Joe Biden somehow beats that? That's just not even theoretically possible, let alone possible. It's crazy. And that just, it goes back to, it isn't the man, it's what he has helped inspire in all of us. One thing I loved when this whole pandemic nonsense started, as they were beginning to shut down states and businesses and so forth, is I remember he got on there and he says, well, I'm believing that we're going to go ahead and we're going to be opening up the country by Easter. And everybody got on that. But, that was the first time I heard anybody actually give a deadline to when the lockdown was going to end.
It's true.
Nobody else was talking about it. They were like, for all we knew, it was just going to go on forever.
Look at Easy Kill Emmanuel, the guy that's the advisor to Biden. He was saying 2 years. He was saying 2 years, and Trump was. And remember the story of the lockdown? It was just meant to prevent hospitals from overflowing.
Right. To get everything caught up, all the PP and all that other stuff, and to be ready for it when it did happen, which it never did.
I mean, it'll go down as one of the kind of saddest ironies of these social control attempts by these corporations. But the idea of wearing a cotton mask on your face day in and day out has got to be the most unsanitary and unhealthy thing any person could possibly do.
And the funny thing is, now that they're rolling the vaccines out, the governors are saying, well, great, but we still want you to wear the mask anyway. Well, what's the point of the vaccine?
Eric,
we're totally making the point about this globalization. It sounds powerful, and it has definitely lightly rooted itself. But, lightly rooted trees, once a breeze comes and it'll blow the damn thing over. But as you see them implement this stuff, it just crumbles. It's junk. There's no science involved in any of their methodology, even if it is theoretical, but in practical application, it just falls apart, and it always has.
Yeah, it's all behaviorism. It's all attempt to control behavior, whether it's climate change or the pandemic. Is the climate changing? Yes. Is it carbon dioxide? Probably not. Is there a virus? Is there a pandemic? I think there is a virus. I think there is something. But the entire public health process and government response to this has been all about social control, except for what Trump has done. I mean, the attempt to develop a vaccine, the intense research, the breakthroughs on it, the expedited time frame, the logistics. If Trump hadn't done that, and they still somehow bring Biden in, they would never have a vaccine. They would never. It would literally be 4 or 5 years before a vaccine ever developed.
Right.
You could just see it. Trump made a major intervention in that regard.
Well, he actually did. Now, it's my understanding, too, I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018, that he actually created an executive order. Now, my understanding is to develop a vaccine, you have to use human tissue. And he actually put out an executive order banning the use of human tissue. So there's a suspicion that this whole vaccine rollout is actually another sting operation against the pharmaceutical companies, which are, some of these big globalist people that are out there, to do what the globalists do. But he's entrapping them by saying, okay, you've rolled out a vaccine, but what was your protocol for development? Because it's impossible for you to have achieved that because of this executive order. He even put one gentleman, I think it was an Alex Azar, in to be basically the guard or the sentry for the National Health Institute, to be sure that this doesn't happen. And that's why you've seen like Chuck Schumer and the left all screaming, we need to get this guy out of there. It's because he was blocking them from doing anything.
Right.
So, I don't know how true, I haven't totally confirmed this, but, it's pretty wild when you think about how a lot of this has been blocked and how it's all just seemingly crumbling, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with anyone who's doubtful of the vaccines and of this whole public health system. How can you not be? Because vaccines are a dual-use technology. The reality is that we have vaccines and we have such a substantial living standard because of both infrastructure, clean water, power supply, and vaccines. They've largely changed the ability to get rid of a lot of the old world diseases. But of course, this technology, especially in the last 50 years, has been abused and taken advantage of by these hardcore eugenicists. I think that I think we're going to have to see how well the vaccine functions and works. Some people are going to obviously take it. We're going to get a sense of how this thing flies. We had the case of an allergic reaction up in Alaska. We'll see what more happens with some of these things. But we have to rebuild a sense of trust in scientific advancement. We all benefit off of, running water and electricity. We all know that industry and technology, the heat-powered machines, generate much of the advancement of our society today. The question is, who's going to control the science and technology and our development? Are we going to let these global resetters, the Davos crowd, the Bill Gates and their oligarchs, or are we going to reclaim that within our constitutional powers as American citizens? And if we do it, we can make it available for that kind of sovereignty, that kind of control over the use of science and technology for advancement, for positive effects. And if we don't take it here, it's hard to imagine any other country really having the ability or power to do it. I mean, look at the European Union. It's basically back to the Habsburg Empire.
Well, I know in America, we're trying to take care of business, and the world is watching, and I think the world is just taking a cue. This takes a lot of courage, but as they pull this off, they're going to say, let's all jump in the water, and you're seeing it everywhere. And I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's not going to be easy, but I think the globalists are going to find themselves on their way out. So, Michael, I want to thank you so much for being on the program today. I was kind of curious with the last minute that we have here. What made you become interested in Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Pact to get you involved?
Well, I had, as a young person with somewhat statistical background, my father served in the Vietnam War and was affected by that. It was kind of a working middle-class family, but my parents moved out to California. Within a couple of years, they were divorced. It was cultural insanity, part of this new left cultural operations. And so, you have your own fights and questions that are on your mind. And I went through college, looked at various economic and scientific questions. And subsequent to 9/11, having worked a couple of years in construction and just gotten out of the college and California environment, I moved back to the Midwest. And was doing a bunch of research. And when I found Mr. LaRouche's writings, here was a guy who was addressing both the deeper cultural aspects of what went wrong, but also laying out a very clear scientific understanding of how we can move out of it, how we can develop, what kind of institutions we've used before, like a national bank and public credit to build infrastructure, the ability for scientific discovery to be a more knowable question. It's possible to create the creative geniuses of people like Einstein or Beethoven. We can create a culture which generates that quality of insight into the universe, into art, into language. And I think that kind of idea, at that moment, I came around in April of 2002, just about 6 months after 9/11. And I saw the deindustrialization. I saw the preponderance of financial markets and finance in economics. Where was the industry? Where was the production?
The creativity, in other words, the creation of
anything. Yeah, right, exactly.
I got
there's no creativity in finance. It's all manipulation. It's all social control.
Right.
So I was just provoked as a young person with various questions and thoughts in my own mind, and just got engaged and just stuck with it, given the threats from the Bush regime and the wars, and then clearly the threats of Obama. It was hard not to stick with it. And when you saw the rise of Trump and what we've now provoked and inspired in the American people, I share your optimism. This fight can be won. We're winning it. We've just got to keep going.
That's right, because it's always going to be there. You're never going to expunge this fight. They've leveled it to good versus evil now, and that's probably the arena it belongs in, to realize, you're going to expunge evil. You may win this war, but it's going to hang around and find a way to get back in there again. And you just got to keep on keeping on, as Joe Dirt would say. Michael, thank you so much for being on the program today. Is there a website people can find out more about the LaRouche Pact and maybe the possibility of getting involved?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I appreciate being on. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed the discussion. If people want to check out more from LaRouche Pact, go to LaRouchePact.com. That's LaRouche, LaRouche, and then PAC.com. We've got daily and weekly email subscriptions. We've got a lot of new material. We'll have a new website out in January, and we're always looking for feedback. And if people, you can email me or contact me via the website.
Well, all right. Well, Michael, again, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks, Daniel.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, wherever you are is where you should be. Have a great day.